Hello and welcome. My name is Baz Khuti. I'm working with CDO Magazine in a series of interviews and also with MIT CDIQ and also the International Society of Chief Data Officers in a series of interviews. Today, I have the pleasure of talking to Philip Miller, co-founder and CEO of Solidatus. Welcome, Philip.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. The approach Solidatus takes is around this data lineage is a really visual map, like what I think is like a tube map, a London tube map, effectively going across your data ecosystem here. What does that exactly mean, and how do you go about helping customers get that, and in particular around data privacy?
Well, okay, so the data privacy question I'll take in a bit, but it's a really good question. How do we build up an organization? And I think this is where lineage has got its bad name from in the past. Okay. And I really believe that lineage is very important from the front line. It's the operational way that the organization is built. Not understanding it is a terrible problem. In terms of building it, I have knowledge about my world, and I go and let's say that I'm in an organization, brand new in an organization. What do? The first thing I do is I ask people, where do I get this piece of information? Sometimes they'll point me towards a document store. Sometimes they'll point me towards a document itself. I doubt there's any one person, once an organization gets to a reasonable size, and I mean 30 or 40 people probably, that knows how everything works.
Right.
At a detailed level. Mm-hmm. But people do. And you go around and you talk to the people, and this is the first part of lineage, right? So you're making connections with lots of other people in the organization. Now, the Solidatus way is to pool all of that knowledge into a very, as you say, visual map, a tube map. Like, how do I get from, so if we're talking London, how do I get from Amersham to Waterloo? I know in my head that there's a couple of ways of doing that. What happens if one of the tube lines is having delays, or there are problems with it, or it's closed that day? What other routes are there? Mm. And this is essentially what we're looking at. We're trying to crowdsource information collaboratively, putting it into a place that everybody who should have permission can use it. Okay. And they can use it efficiently. So it should be intuitive.
Do you automate that? Is that, obviously you're meeting people, crowdsourcing is a great way of looking at it in terms of getting their knowledge captured. But in terms of building that visual map, do you have some automation around that in terms of crawling that, or is that?
So I think that's where it starts. There's a little bit of fear at the beginning, of like, oh gosh, my organization is really complicated. How do you get all this data in? I think the way that we think about it is two problems. There's the discovery problem. There's the problem of getting the organization's map into Solidatus, the blueprint in there. Yeah. And then there's the second problem is, okay, now I've got the organization mapped in there. How do I change it? How do I do a new regulation, a new thing? So we take those as two discrete problems. One is highly automated, and the other is also always going to be people driven to a degree. Like, there's going to be a principal who's requiring change. There's going to be a reason for that change. There'll be requirements, and all those things, if you do it right, can be driven by a Solidatus first approach. You use Solidatus to build the requirements and to simulate the change and to see if it will work, to see the cost of ownership of things. Right. The first aspect is, we can probably get to about 75, 80% by automation to get the blueprint in. There'll always be something where a person is needed, or there'll be something historic which is no longer available as a source, or, the things that are like that you can imagine in every organization. And the other side of it is there's always going to be a bit of ambiguity. What I call entity, you might call counterparty or client. There's always going to be sort of am I talking in the same language as you? So when I say client and you say entity, are we really meaning the same thing, or is there a slight variance? And there'll always be a little bit of a conversation around the edges just to get things correct.
Okay. And then how does this get just represented at the client, and how does the client now store this and look after this and manage this? How does that happen? How do you sort of keep it, the care and feeding of it once you built it? It must be a very complex layout in a major.
It can be. And I think that's a really good observation, and that's, I think, again where these types of applications, these sort of data and metadata applications fall down, because things appear too complicated. I think one of the joys of using Solidatus is we kind of made it a bit of a game almost. So, making it pleasant and a pleasant experience. You don't have to go through 5-6 pages of documentation to organize a critical data element. You just right click, type a couple of things, and then you can move on. Someone else can fill in a little bit of detail, but it's usable straight away. So I guess we're trying to gamify it to make it almost addictive, to get the next bit, to keep it going like that. And the organization of the data then is really down to the organization itself. Some parts of organizations will really need detail in some areas, and they'll have broad brush macro views of other places. If you're really interested in your application, you perhaps want to know about how your application works in detail and what your effect is to people who take information from you. You don't need to see everything about every other application. So we try at all points to give you the power as a user to define the sort of the height above other people's data sets, and even your own that you work at, so that you can, if you like, focus in on the things that are important. We try to declutter things as quickly as possible. Oh, sure, there's a cluttered view. We love showing people the cluttered view, because when we can show clicking a button how it can be made simple.
Simplified, yeah. Okay.
But the world is messy. We have a saying. Data isn't expensive. Complexity is, and complexity hides problems. We try to declutter the world as quickly as possible to let you focus in on what's important for you.
Important in context to what you're trying to do. And back to that privacy question and the observation around privacy and movement of data across borders and organizations. How do you see privacy, and what's some of the biggest challenges related to privacy?
So privacy is really interesting in so many ways for the data professional. I guess I'm a bit of a data geek. When I first started, in the 90s, I was sitting on the front office. I was an IT guy sitting next to the really important traders, and they'd say, "Get me this piece of data and do this thing with it. Put it in this display. Off you go, bish bash bosh." Took no time at all. And I think people still think back to those days and go, "Why is it so slow these days?" Everything we seem to have done in the last 25 years seems to have slowed down the delivery of IT. Well, the truth is that privacy is really probably one of the elements that's at the root of this. You've got to use data for the things that people expect you to use it for. So if I give permission for you to know my data for a healthcare reason, so I need to tell you as my bank that I have a health condition because you're going to give me a loan to buy a house. I need to disclose any health problems I've got. I do not expect you to sell that data to an insurance company to then give me direct marketing to either insure me or to sell me some quack solution to my health problem. That's not what I gave you the data for. So, but 25 years ago, that may well have been a legitimate way for an organization to make money. It's to take, and I'm not saying there was any bank that I worked at that did this, but you can imagine quite quickly how data given from one purpose, when there's no boundaries, can be used for something entirely improper or that wasn't expected. And we kind of expect that these days. We say these are the purposes for the use of our data. Now, why is it complicated? Well, because there isn't just one rule about the use of data, and there isn't just one country in the world. And in our very connected world, I may be in the UK, I might be using a cloud service in America, which is run by a company in Argentina, which has some operatives for support in India. Now, whose data protection laws do you trust? And should the guy in Argentina look at my data in America? Should my data even be in America? Can I be supported by the guy in India, even though the company is based in Argentina? These types of questions really grind the machine down, and they make the machine very, very slow. And I think we went through a period, particularly towards, maybe the introduction of GDPR, but there was data protection around before that, where we were kind of just stuck in the gaze of the headlights. Well, who can use what data? It became very manual immediately. What we see is that this is an ecosystem. There is a blueprint. There's always logic behind each of the use cases for data. So I have a piece of data for a particular purpose. I am in a particular job. It's processed in a particular place. It's stored in a particular place. And I can keep it for this long. They're the broad brush questions. That's really codifiable. We can draw a graph up of this inside Solidatus. We can link all these concerns together. And then we can say, just ask the question. I'm Phil. I work in financial crime prevention. I would like to see this person's data because I think they're performing some financial crime. I am in Malta.
Okay.
The answer is yes or no.
All right. Okay.
And that should be something that's codified. Now, we do this really well. So the traditional way of doing this would either have been to go someone to a leaf through, like, goodness me, I'm in the UK, my data's in America, the operatives in Malta, blah, 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 blah. They would go through the rule books, and they would say, okay, so some cross-referencing, some Malta, United States, United Kingdom, what's the that could take weeks, honestly, and lawyers' time and everything else. Yeah. Or you can make business rules up. So a typical bank, probably just for data privacy and just for some of their major countries, probably has 5 or 6 million business rules for this. Right. Or you could draw a picture inside Solidatus, and you can actually see how it works. You click on a button, and then it says, oh, yes, you can do this, or, oh, no, you can't. And you can see exactly where and the reason. And it's the other thing is, it's not subjective. I'm not going through a bunch of people who are interpreting things, and maybe not in their first language or in a particular order. So I get idempotency, this magical property where if I do the same thing twice, I always get the same result.
And so do companies have to change their approach and change things, to adopt this? Do they have to rip and replace things, or do they leverage what they've got today? How do they go about sort of taking this approach and this strategy for data lineage to support the privacy, the codifying of institutional knowledge and business rules into simple drag and drop is what you've provided. But to put that in place, do they have to change a lot of their infrastructure, or how do they do
I think at the sort of conceptual level, if you look at the top of organizations, you want a governance framework in place. Yeah. So, and oftentimes there are localized governance frameworks, but is there a sort of overarching legal framework under which the organization works? So potentially there are big banks, for example, out there that have these things in place, and potentially they don't. And you can easily see, if you're merging two organizations, you're merging legal frameworks as well. Now, part of this is kind of defining your approach so that you understand that actually, if you get this legal framework right, and then you push that legal framework out to the organization, that you're going to get resistance in the organization. Well, I've always made the decision about this. Well, I've always been allowed to do this. So there is a kind of there has to be a reality check that the people at the top of organizations are actually really responsible now for the data use within their organizations, whereas beforehand you could kind of wash your hands with it and say, okay, yes, so it was that person in that country, they broke the rules, then they're fired. But actually these days, people don't accept that. It's your company, you had the data breach, or you sold my data for the wrong thing. It doesn't matter if it was big bank in Luxembourg or big bank in Mexico or big bank in India. It doesn't make any difference. Big bank is the same thing everywhere. Yeah. And therefore there's one person who's responsible. The share price is the share price. So the responsibility now has bubbled up to the board level. And I think the first recognition was just throw money and people at the problem. But actually that's self-defeating. You need to throw some automation at it. And the only way you can throw automation at it is by being sensible about your frameworks and your approach.
It's great talking to you, Phil. Thank you so much for your time today. Really enjoyed the conversation. Please visit CDO Magazine for additional interviews. Thank you so much.
Thank you.